How will new trans sports policies and athlete inclusion affect girls' sports? Well, this is a huge question pressing in our culture today. And I'm here with an expert, a friend of mine who recently did his doctoral dissertation on this question. His name is Dr. Gabriel Higerd, and he did his doctoral dissertation at the United States Sports Academy. He's a certified strength and conditioning specialist, father of 6. That's 3 more kids than I have, Gabe. I don't know how you do it. He, he was an adjunct professor of exercise science at Azusa Pacific University and an Army officer. Gabe, thanks so much for coming on and talking about such an important but also a sensitive topic.
Yeah, thank you, Sean. Certainly is just a huge topic right now. It's in the news and excited to have this platform. So
Well,
thank
let's
you.
jump in. And of all the things you could study with your background in sports, why would you study this topic?
Yeah, so how does a conservative collegiate strength coach and football coach get into this? That's a frequent question that I get. So, well, I was working on my doctorate in sports management, and I had a little emphasis with exercise physiology. Um, I got into worldview issues, and I really had a strong sense. I read John Piper's book, Don't Waste Your Life." It was really
Wow.
impactful for me, and so I knew I wanted to do something impactful. About that same time, the whole transgender issue broke loose in the international scene. So 2015, they changed their policy, dramatically changing the landscape. Um, about that same time, I was going through some peer-reviewed academic journals. In these journals, there was various statements such as there's no biological difference between transgender um, women and biological females, and basically pushing for full inclusion because
Wow.
of a lack of evidence. And I took that charge and said, all right, well, I'll be part of looking into this a little bit further and seeing what evidence there is. So having 5 girls probably
Yeah.
influenced the picture as well.
No, that makes sense. I have a daughter who's 13 who competes athletically, and the idea of getting scholarships and who she competes about, even questions of safety as she gets older, about 15 or 16, those boys can hit very hard in volleyball. So I can imagine having
Oh yeah.
5 daughters. This is a personal issue. Now, some people have done research on similar issues in the past, like Mark Regnerus, for example, was really taken to task by people because he had the courage to speak in issues like same sex unions and
Mm-hmm.
came to some conclusions that said he disagreed with some of the facts that were out there. Obviously, there's a constituency of people who would not want you to do this research and probably push back. Were there those kinds of hurdles, or was it welcomed because people just want to know the truth about how inclusion of trans athletes will affect sports policy?
Yeah, so my doctoral committee, there was one committee member that was a challenge that I had to
Mm,
overcome, and so worked through that. I had 2 pretty supportive, one female high up in a university, and she was extremely helpful in helping the process move along, but ultimately it got done. But what I'm seeing now, as I'm trying to get my data and my research published in peer-reviewed academic journals, I'm starting to face a lot more scrutiny ideologically,
interesting.
and ultimately, I think I'm going to have to go out of the U.S. system and go to a British journal internationally in order to get it published. At least that part of my study that is quite controversial. It's good data, it's good science, but a lot of people would not like the result, and so yeah, it is something to be concerned about.
So the concern is the politics, not necessarily the data or the research. Okay.
Yeah.
So let's jump into the uniqueness of the study that you did, because this is going to really help us see specifically with data and numbers how trans athletes will practically affect sports. These kind of
Mm-hmm.
numbers are powerful because apart from this, I've heard a lot of stories and we've heard individual cases and narratives which are important, but your data is very revealing. Now we're going to jump into some of that data, But tell me first what was your approach and what kind of made it unique to this kind of question?
Yeah, so my study is probably the largest known study of American high school track and field performances. And so it's nearly 1 million performances. It
Wow.
involved five states in 8 different events: the high jump, the long jump, 100 meters through the 3,200 meters, and it involves 3 different years, so 2017, 18, and 19. And so I pulled the data. I conducted statistical analysis on both the spread and the difference between males and females. But the centerpiece of my study was statistical modeling and predictive modeling that tried to find out the potential transgender dominance or lack of, um, if
Okay.
the assumptions are true from the transgender activists themselves. So that was how I did it.
So over 1 million cases in 3 years. So you have some significant data to back up some of the findings that we're gonna get into. Now tell me why. Let me just step
Yeah.
back for a second. Those of you just joined us, we're here with Dr. Gabe Higerd, who did his recent doctoral research at the United States Sports Academy on, I know I'm butchering the title, but the effect of transgender athletes and how it'll affect girls' sports in particular in track. And studied over 1 million cases and athletes, so to speak. And we're going to see how those numbers play out. But tell me, just kind of culturally speaking, why is this issue so hot right now? Because when you started this 3 years ago, it was just coming on the cultural radar. Now it's
Hmm.
kind of exploding.
Yeah, so you'll see it in the news constantly now. Well, on day one of President Biden's administration, we saw him fulfill a campaign promise, that is to elevate transgender inclusion and transgender rights to the level of other rights such as race or sex. And so he did that through his executive order, and that directs the Department of Education and the Office of Civil Rights in that mode in everything that they do. We also have seen recently in Connecticut, there was 2 male runners who transitioned and started to compete in the female category. One did it in the middle of the year, so he competed in the winter time in the male
Okay.
category, and both of them were very average. So very average, transitioned and competed against the females in the spring in the outdoor season, and became the state champion instantly.
Wow.
Um, at the college level, there's an individual who was again very average male performer, transitioned over to competing with the females, and now is the NCAA national champion. Um, there's the looming Equality Act, which I assume a lot of you viewers are pretty familiar with in
Sure.
terms of religious liberty concerns. But obviously, it basically would codify the California and 18 other states' regulations nationwide. And those regulations basically are self ID. So you could literally show up in California right now and compete in the 100 meters in the male category, and then later in the afternoon in the 200 or 1,000, 1,500 or whatever, instantly compete in the female classification just with self ID.
Okay, I got to
So
jump in. I did not know that. That is news to me. In the same day, you can compete in California and possibly beyond as a male and a female in different events just because of how you choose to identify.
correct. That's how the law is written. So that's hypothetical. No
Wow.
one has done that. Um, no one's tried it. No one's done it. It's never been documented. But currently, that is the law, and
Wow.
that is how the Equality Act is structured, and that is also how the Biden executive order is structured.
So this is an international story. It's a political story. It's a local story in Connecticut and California. So it's kind of coming from all angles right now, and we're seeing such rapid change that we got to see where the data points. Now, before we jump into your data, would you just list off for me what are some of the fundamental differences between males and females in terms of how much oxygen they process, body mass, strength, etc.? What are some of those basic differences that we should be aware of, athletically speaking?
Yeah, so there's there's roughly 6,000 different biomarkers that are different between males and females. Many of
Wow.
those contribute to athletic success. And
Hmm.
so during male puberty, male testosterone spikes 15 or 20 times. Along with that testosterone comes some major changes. This leads to males being 7 to 8% taller. So we're
Hmm.
taller. That means we have longer bones. Those bones are also thicker, they're more dense. So we have wider shoulders, narrower hips, which both are advantageous for a lot of athletics. We have larger mass, 40% greater mass on the upper body alone, 30% overall on average. Now, not everybody's there, but we
Sure.
have greater amount of muscle, less fat. We have more fast twitch muscle fibers, so those fast twitch fibers that help explosion speed, etc. Our fiber cross sectional area is even bigger. So, along
Wow.
with the muscle and bone, our lungs are bigger, our hearts are bigger. We have more stroke volume, which gets the oxygen to the blood or to the muscles that need it more effectively. We even have more hemoglobin, which is the protein that's on the red blood cell that carries that oxygen to where it's needed, about 12% more. This lends to an incredible advantage in VO2 max, which means endurance capability. We'll be able to do a lot better there. And so ultimately, this comes out to be about between 5 and 50% difference in performance depending on the sport. 5% is probably the absolute lowest, and that's with ultra endurance swimming. So think of, swimming from Dana Point to Catalina. They'll have a race, and at some in some races, the females can be extremely competitive. Um, but
Interesting.
if you start to get into anything slower than that, or shorter distance, or things that rely especially on upper body strength or power, that's when we start to see massive difference. In Olympic weightlifting, pound for pound, if you take two identical individuals, the male will lift uh, about 35% greater amount of weight on that. So on average, guys are 50% stronger in the upper body. And so in track and field,
Wow.
what we see is a 10 to 12% difference on average, and that's just for the running sports. The jumping is around 19%. And so in addition to this being a competitive issue, it's also a safety issue because you have mass times velocity, and that equals momentum. That's the equation for momentum. So if you have mass times velocity and guys on average are bigger, but they're also moving faster, then you start to see some really issues with injury risk um, that goes along with that. So there's a huge significant or very significant issue with both those aspects of competitiveness and
Let,
safety.
let's take a minute and talk about the safety aspect. I want to give a quick shout out to Andrew, Ryan, Susan, and who else we got in here? Darren, who just regularly join us and ask great questions. So nice to have you today. We're with Dr. Gabe Higerd, who's done his PhD research on the effect of what trans athletes inclusion would have on sports, and in particular track and field. You mentioned safety. One of the stories that hit maybe 2 or 3 years ago, if I remember, was this UFC trans
Mm.
female that was a male and just destroyed this girl's jaw. That was a public one that at least gave some people pause.
Mm-hmm.
Are there
Yeah.
other cases like that of individuals where people just in sports have been really physically harmed because a male hit them in a way a female just wouldn't have that power and velocity?
Yeah, so that was 2014 Fallon Fox, and that individual broke the skull of the girl that she was wrestling.
Gosh.
or fighting in MMA. Um, and and ultimately no one after that, no lady would fight fight Fallon anymore. So
Yeah.
other than that, there hasn't really been anyone that sticks out. But World Rugby just this last fall became the first international organization to take a stance of exclusively having the female category be reserved for girls, for females. And so that's wildly controversial, but they
Wow.
did the most exhaustive review of the data and of the science, and they came to the conclusion, and I believe the right conclusion, that player safety is absolutely critical in this. Because just think about it, you've got typically in a female category, the larger individuals are on average the slower individuals. Well, if you have a male who's both larger and faster, and
Mm.
then inputted into the equation of being bigger and faster, significantly bigger in many cases, it's a real recipe for potential injury.
What other ways are girls hurt by? And I mean, I could think of like like scholarship. My wife got scholarship to go to play basketball in college, and she just was probably she fought so hard, was the kind of person who got that last scholarship because she just worked harder than everyone and played and competed at that level. But I start to look at
Yeah.
my daughter and think, well, if things change over the next 5 years, will there be less opportunities
Mm,
for her? Is that an example? We can think of other ways that girls will actually be hurt, because I'm frankly not concerned about
yeah.
guys being hurt by this. To me,
Right.
if girls can come compete, like, more power to them. It's guys wrecking girls sports, so to speak, that's the concern. Are there other ways that should be on a radar that girls would get hurt emotionally, physically, etc. by this?
Yeah, so a real practical example is the case of the Connecticut girls. And so three of those
Hmm.
Connecticut girls are now working a lawsuit up. They've all since graduated, and the two transgender individuals have also graduated from high school. And those three girls are in college, and I've been in contact with their parents and their lawyer, and so they're continuing to work through this with their Title IX lawsuit, which I think is a good thing. Alliance
Yeah.
Defending Freedom is defending that, but those girls, it's heartbreaking to talk to them. Several of them finished second place on numerous occasions in order to be a state champion, and weren't. I was also contacted through my social media by a girl who was bumped out of the regionals. And so, from instead of going to regional finals, she was in, like, I think it was eighth or ninth place, and bumped her out of the finals because of two
Wow.
individuals there. And so, so that's one example. In real life, I think right now we haven't seen a flood of transgender individuals in this. Yes, we have Connecticut, and yes, we have these other cases, but absolutely the potential is there. And especially
Mm.
when you're talking about scholarships, it's a big deal. I just think of say say myself. If I really, I don't know if I have any eligibility left, but I potentially could sign up and say, hey, I'm a female, and go to the Stanford rowing coach and jump on their crew team. And I feel pretty confident that I could outperform some of those ladies um, in there. And I'm not anything special. I'm not trying to
Sure.
trying to say anything. And those ladies are amazing, but we're just physiologically different. And so I would, and we'll get into some of the other
Yeah.
data, but yes, it's a major issue, um, and there's going to be major temptation when you tie a lot of money to it in terms of scholarships.
Let's get into some of the data. I have a bunch more questions that are related to culturally and some of the I want to represent the other side as fairly as we can, and we talked about that a little bit
Mm-hmm.
ahead of time. But tell me what some of the data revealed in your study, and I'll leave it more open like that rather than lead you into it. What does the data reveal about the inclusion of transports, who wins and who dominates,
Mm-hmm.
etc.?
Yeah, so first of all, my study found that the average difference, the mean difference in performance in all these categories was 18%. It was the lowest in the 100 meters at 14%, and the highest in the long jump at 24%. And so, for a lot of people, those numbers aren't very significant. But when we just visually, it's hard to follow those. But when we think about the amount of boys in every single case that is better than the best female, then we can visually see how this looks. And in every event, hundreds and even thousands of boys was better than the best female. The closest it ever gets in my study was the case of Tara Davis in 2017 in California.
Okay.
She set the California, or excuse me, the national long jump record. And this
Okay.
record had stood since before I was born. It's been that
Okay.
way, and it may exist for another couple decades. But just in California, just that year, she was beaten by 79 boys, um, and that's the
Wow.
closest it ever gets. For the rest of California, in events from the 200 to the 1600, in each and every event, there was at least 15,000 boys or 1,500 boys, 1,500 boys that were better than the best female. And so if only 0.02% of those 1,500 decided to be transgender, they could take the top three spots on the podium. Or put it another way, you could have a guy who's number 1,416, and he could, at the switch of a hat, go and be the state champion after being that far down in the rankings as a
Wow.
female.
So your research was not on actual trans athletes competing right now and beating girls because there's not enough doing this. You took the numbers of guys and girls and compared them and said if just a small percentage of guys identify girls and compete, even number 1446 would
Mm-hmm.
win state in a number of different
Yeah.
fields. Did I get that correct?
That's correct. Yeah. So it took the assumptions from the transgender activists and the available estimates that we have of about 0.7% of persons that are transgender, actually young adults, uh, and followed those through to the logical conclusions.
Did, did your research cover, or have you studied independently, if the girls would take, say, testosterone shots, would that narrow the percentage and make a difference? How much would that change if they went through the year of taking testosterone, and what other kind of supplements or procedures were necessary to become more physiologically male, I guess you could say? Would that narrow the difference
Mm.
significantly or no?
So there's been a recent study that has just come out and has combined all of the available research studies, and so it's kind of a cumulative look at what's out there, and based on everything that we've known of treatment, what it does, um, it does not eliminate the advantage of males. So males
Wow.
who are here
Wow.
drop down to here. So they lose about 5%, 5 to 10% in some cases. And the females on testosterone um, jump up about 10%, 10 to 12%. So
Okay.
even a female who's on testosterone, anabolic steroids, is still not deemed a threat to the male competitive balance. And they're not even deemed a threat, really, to the
Hmm.
a person, a biological male who's on estrogen and testosterone blockers. And the International Olympic Committee knows this. So they don't have any policy restricting females going to the male category. So the
Okay.
fastest woman on earth, she can go, she can take testosterone if she wants, she can go compete in the male event, and she's not going to be a threat. She's still going to have the same bone structure. She's still going to have the wider hips, the narrow shoulders, um, other issues that even if she increases her muscle mass significantly by taking testosterone, she still will not have a physiological advantage, and she will not be competitive.
Wow, that's really interesting to see that. Let me ask a question that came here from Dr. Nose, and then we'll get to some of the other questions that you and I discussed. How about in team sports? Is there a difference in performance in team sports like basketball, volleyball, etc.? I know that wasn't the unique focus of your doctoral research, but you've studied this.
Mm-hmm.
How do team sports compare to some of the individual like track and field?
Yeah, so we have no idea as far as team sports, but uh, comparing apples to apples is almost impossible to study some of that. You can look and visually see, okay, this basketball player is better than this basketball player, whether it be NBA versus WNBA, etc. But quantifying that scientifically is very tough. So
Hmm.
that's why I chose the subjects that I chose. I would have liked to pick some different ones. I would have liked to pick the bench press, the squat, some of these other lifts. I would have liked to do the shot put and the javelin or the
Yeah.
hammer, but those events, the male and the female implement the thing that they're throwing is vastly different in weight. So you can't compare apples to apples.
Gotcha.
You
Gotcha.
can't even compare hurdles, males and females. Why? They're both running, even if they're running the same distance, because the males jump over higher hurdles. And so you can't necessarily compare
Interesting.
apples to apples. That's why I studied what I studied, because the long jump is the long jump, the high jump is the high jump,
Gotcha.
and all the distances I can compare exactly apples to apples. So it's a great question. I think my data would have carryover. So I think if you're
Sure.
faster, if you're bigger and you're stronger, and we can prove that in one sport, I think the carryover goes to combat sports, field hockey, basketball, volleyball, etc., where it's a lot more difficult to quantify the advantage there. So it's a great question, um, and it needs to be researched if somebody can come up with a good model.
That makes sense of some of the differences. I'm glad you researched it, have numbers behind it. In some ways, having played college basketball myself, and I played against girls who were in the WNBA, and they're
Mm-hmm.
amazing females. But by the time you get to college, even the best female is just not going to be able to compete with a lower level college sport like basketball, football, baseball. And like you've consistently said, it's not better or worse, it's just different how we've made. So in some ways, it's like, do we really need the data? It's obvious, but today we
Right.
do. And the
Mm-hmm.
amount of data and the differences, I think, is what's really telling, even more significant than maybe we would expect. Now, you have a line in your dissertation where you said the average boy is better than 94 to 98% of girls. What does that mean?
Yeah. So if you take Mr. Average, statistically. So if he's middle of the pack, he's better than 50%, and he's worse than 50%. You take
Got it.
that boy, if he was a boy that you plucked out, and you put him into the female field, he will be in the top 2 to top
Mm,
6% of the female field instantly, just by moving him over. Now, if you do the reverse and you take the
interesting.
average female, miss average, middle of the pack, and you take her, pluck her out, move her over to the male category, she fits in the very bottom 2 to 6% of individuals of males.
Wow.
So that's how it's a massive difference there, and that was shocking to me because we with this embrace of equality across society,
Yep.
Marvel movies, showing the powerful women and all this stuff. It's great in a lot of cases, but physically, God made us so different that the differences are absolutely stark when in terms of statistics.
So let me ask you to play the other side, so to speak, than the view that you hold. If you are going to make a case for the inclusion of transgender athletes in sports, what would it look like? And I'm asking you to make it as charitably and as strong as
Hmm.
you can. I read a bunch of articles today trying to
Hmm.
get a sense of where these arguments are coming from, because I know there's a lot of smart people who believe it and think it's a civil rights issue. So what would
Hmm.
that look like to make a case for inclusion of trans athletes in sports?
Yeah, so the three most common arguments that you'll see, number one is that they'll say there's no evidence that supports that transgender persons have an advantage. My research and a growing body of evidence kind of pushes that one to the side and pushes
Okay.
that away. So the most common um, one that you'll hear is what's called the myth of the level playing field. And so that would go something like this. Well, Michael Phelps, he has physiological advantages that uniquely create a good swimmer. So bigger hands, bigger feet, longer limbs, torso size, etc.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing with LeBron James. Same thing with um, Usain Bolt, and to some extent, Simone Biles. Her shorter stature creates different advantages for her in that sport. So that stuff is not fair. There's no fairness in that. And so they would say the whole idea that sports are fair, it is kind of a ridiculous thing. So transgender persons, that's just one more diverse aspect of the human condition.
Okay.
Just like having a coach, just like being born in America is an advantage, just like having good nutrition, having good parents is an advantage. Transgender issues is just one more potential advantage. And the response to that, um, from my from my standpoint, is that there is no other factor, whether whether it be environmental, whether it be nutritional, whether it be um, psychological or physiological, that has the same effect as sex does. The
Mm.
bimodal distribution, the separation of the sexes, simply based on what testosterone does during male puberty, uh, is undeniable and unlike any other thing.
Wow. Wow. Okay. Here's a practical one from a friend of mine, Ryan Pauly. He was in our bioapologetics program. High school teacher. He says, question: what is the current laws regarding transgender athletes taking testosterone? How is that not seen as a performance enhancing drug, which is universally
Yeah,
blocked?
yeah. So he's talking about, I assume, a female person taking testosterone, and so they would have to get what's called a therapeutic use exemption. So a doctor has to say you're taking this for a valid medical purpose, and therefore it's okay to do. And so current laws basically would allow that. Um, this brings to mind the case of Max Beggs in Texas. So a few years ago, there was a wrestler, female, started taking testosterone, wanted to transition to male, but the Texas law on the books said you have to compete according to your birth certificate. And so they kept her in the female classification, but at the same time allowed her to take testosterone.
Oh
And so
gosh.
we know what was going to happen. She never lost a single match, just absolute domination her entire high school career. because she was wrestling against girls while she was juiced up on testosterone. We would expect to see that. Now, she's or Beggs has moved on to college and is now at an NEI school, walked on to wrestling team there, and in the last 2 years hasn't wrestled a single person. So, um,
Huh.
so that's one case of that happening. So there's really again the female to male or girls going into the guys category really is an issue for a lot of us coaches
Sure.
or strength people. Certainly it has moral issues, and so that would be an issues for Christian institutions, certainly Christian schools, to consider of how we're going to treat this. But current law kind of allows them to compete wherever they want, basically.
There was a USA Today article I read this afternoon. It said, quote, all the citations about trans female athletes winning competitions failed to mention that just like every other athlete, they don't always win. They lose, but we rarely see those headlines in the mainstream media. That seems true, but I'm guessing you're going to push back on that for a few reasons. Tell me your thoughts.
Yeah. So at the top, where people win and lose, there is no overlap. Below average males will. Um, it is true that below average males will not beat the females, but 8 to 16% of the boys in all the categories will beat the best girl 100% of the time. I'll say it
Wow.
again, 8 to 16% of the boys will beat the fastest girl in the state in the event 100% of the time. And so, uh, really, we could think about it like this: if we had 100, say we had 100 transgender individuals in an event, and they ran the event. Well, you could see the headline, and they would be true that overwhelming majority of transgender individuals are beaten by girls, and that could be true if 97 of those transgender individuals were beaten. But we're worried about the three. So if three were not beaten by the best girl, that would mean three individuals on the podium that would be biologically male. And so that's what we're concerned about. So we're not. So there certainly is overlap, and we're not worried about me beating Shelly Ann Fraser Price. She's the fastest woman on earth, and if you line me up against her, it would be funny, but yeah, it would be a joke. She would smoke me. So we're not worried about that. But we are worried about Doug from the Mammoth Track Club racing against Shelly Ann Fraser Price, because Doug can beat her, and he would then instantly become the world's fastest woman. Or Mike down at Mission Viejo High School or San Clemente or wherever you are in the country, you live nearby a male who can beat the fastest woman on earth. I almost guarantee it.
Now, I remember hearing a stat, you can correct me if I totally got this wrong, that this runner you're referring to, that in any given year, 300 high school athletes beat her top time, and she's the most decorated female track Olympian in history. Did I get that right, or what details did I miss?
Yeah, yeah. Every year there's thousands of boys and men that are faster than the fastest ever women's time. And so roughly 2,000 people, 2,000 males every year,
Okay.
and many of them are high school boys that can
Wow.
perform, to, who can run. The top women's times are around 10:07. Um, her times, her times at the top of the female Olympics are probably not good enough to get a Division I scholarship. Actually, I know they're not good enough to get a Division I scholarship in America, in male category. So yeah, the differences are that stark.
That is really interesting. Wow. Now here's a fascinating question for you. Darren says, let me pull this over. He says, are there many or any outspoken transgender voices speaking out against and agree with the case that you're making here about the unfair advantage for girls or disadvantage for girls?
Yeah, there's one that I recently saw. I don't know her name. She's in the UK, or they are in the UK. They're speaking out about this. But there's probably the most prominent transgender voice on this is a person by the name of Joanna Harper. And if you watch enough on this issue, you'll hear that name. But this individual is a solid researcher, and they were part of the case at the international level to restrict rather than permit open access to transgender or transgender inclusion into female category. Now, the area that we really disagree on, Harper believes that 1 year of testosterone suppression and estrogen reverses the male advantage, which that is totally
Wow.
not true, and it is not what the current evidence says. But that's one person out there. So I can't really think of any others right now.
Yeah, that's fine. Uh, what I do find interesting is that people like Martina Navratilova, who is lesbian and one of the great tennis players of all time, has been pushing against this and getting a lot of backlash. So here's another really interesting question
Mm-hmm.
that Andrew asked. He says, are there any top women athletes advocating for trans athletes in their sport that you're aware of?
Hmm. No, no, I don't. Um, not that I've seen. But on the reverse side of that, we don't see a lot of condemnation. One of the
Huh.
greatest secular sins right now is to be judgmental or to be labeled a bigot. And so these women are terrified. I've talked to some
Mm.
personally. They've been beaten and they want to speak out and they want to say, hey, this is
Wow.
messed up, but I'm a current athlete and this is outrageous. What's going on? But I don't want to be labeled a bigot for my position,
Mm.
and so they're just kind of going along with the flow, and that's pretty common. I've talked to women's administrators who are at the collegiate level who are coaches, and they think the same thing, but they're basically just terrified of being canceled as being, for being bigoted in their views and against the trans community, LGBTQ rights, etc. So I appreciate Martina Navratilova. She took the charge and she's moving forward with it. Now she doesn't defend high school sports, so she's willing
Mm.
to throw kind of the high school girls under the bus. But
Ah.
but at the elite level, she's standing up and saying, yeah, at the elite level, you can't have this be in the policy.
That's a really fair point about the fear of a lot of people to speak up because if J.K. Rowling is going to get attacked and they're going to try to cancel her and they're going to go after Martina Navratilova,
Mm-hmm.
people without as much money, name recognition, power, you name it, of course they're going to be afraid. In many ways, they're just like, I want to compete in this sport. I didn't get into this for politics. So it makes sense that there's a lot of people just afraid to speak out on that.
Yeah.
Um, one other question for you is some would say, haven't trans athletes been competing in college sports for decades with minimal fallout? I wasn't really aware of this, but they've been competing for a long time. So, what's the big deal?
There have been a lot of uh, or documented cases of transgender individuals competing in college, but they have all been biological females and they identify as males and they're
Okay.
staying on female teams. So there's a prominent, the first one at the Division One level was a basketball player, um, and she remained on the female team. Um, the Division 3 shot put national record right now is held by a man, um, a biological female who is transgender. But it's in the female classification. So,
Okay.
there hasn't been really anybody to test besides the case of CC Telfer that I referenced earlier. There hasn't been a real push, by others going the controversial direction, which is male trying to compete with the females. There's a
Mm,
runner in Idaho, um, or excuse me, University of Montana cross country runner right now, as well as Boise State. There's a runner that's trying to compete, and so that is stirring some controversy because both of them are biological males trying to compete with the women's group.
interesting. Very interesting. What one of the people are trying to come up with solutions, and one solution people say is, why can't we start a distinct classification for transgender athletes?
Yeah, so there's really three issues with that. Number one is just the population numbers. So if the
Mm,
estimates are true, if there's only 0.7%, or if there is 0.7%, that may be a lot. Um, if you're trying to fill up a volleyball team, how do you do that at the high school level? Maybe you have a couple individuals, and then you maybe could combine to make a team with a couple
mm,
other high schools in your region. And then how would you play? You travel out of state and to do that. So making a schedule, um, and team wise, it would be pretty impractical. Second is the transgender activists would reject it outright.
mm.
One of their monikers is trans girls are girls, period. End of story. Anything less, they will not accept. So they'll reject that proposal outright. And then number three is, there could be a fairness and safety issue with that as well, because you could have, a 17-year-old biological male with no hormonal intervention, just regular male who identifies as female, competing against another 17-year-old male who's been on puberty blockers since he was
Okay.
13. And now he's got the body of a 13-year-old at age 17. And they're in the same classification, or anywhere along the hormonal treatment spectrum, would create real safety issues as well as competitive disadvantage for all these people who are going through different medical issues related to this.
Mm. Those three factors are helpful. By the way, there's a comment by Ken McClure who says Dan Crenshaw did a great interview with the transgender. I heard that interview, and as somebody who went through the transition and had serious concern medically and experientially and is now speaking out against it. So, if someone wants to put the link in the question and answer, that is the comment section. That is a great interview, and I'm really glad that was brought up. Give us an
Right.
update if you don't mind. We'll have time for a handful more questions here, but where's this legal fight going? Where do you see it headed if you had to guess and anticipate?
Yeah, so I didn't quite check the news today, but if the House, or if Biden is expected to sign this stimulus plan, there's going to be quite a lot of dollars at stake going to these states. And um, the, their administration has already labeled Title IX funding coming from the Department of Education will go to states that comply with Title IX requirements. One of those requirements now is the LGBTQIA
Hmm.
expanding, anagram, in terms of participation in sports. And so it could be that he may withhold some funding for, say, Idaho, Montana, some of these other states who have moved on this. South Dakota, as of I think today, they just signed a law, and that would trigger, I figure, court action going up to the Supreme Court. The other one is this would move forward with the Connecticut case, and so those girls, are working their way through the courts, And that may end up at the Supreme Court. Ultimately, I believe
Mm,
that the Supreme Court is going to have to rule on this issue. They're going to have to give some guidance, because what
yeah.
they did in Bostock um, really muddied the waters. Bostock changed Title VII and has direct implications with Title IX, but in the opinion, they wrote that, okay, this is going to be an issue that we're going to consider later. We just hope and pray that the mental reasoning and the legal minds behind the Bostock decision don't prevail in this case, and it goes a
Mm.
favorable direction.
Here's just a real practical one that I think is interesting. I'd like to know. You had mentioned earlier that some of the biological advantages that males have, and one of the disadvantages in terms of competing for women in sports is wider hips and narrower shoulders. So the question is, if that was interpreted correctly, correct it, but it says, how do wider hips and narrow shoulders slow women down when it comes to running?
Yeah, so there's a kinematic factor. So ability, just relationships within the bones and the joints that make it more efficient. And
Huh.
so the wider hips, something called the Q angle. It's a wider angle and it's less efficient. And so if you take a woman with the exact same physiological makeup of body fat, muscle composition, height, and weight as a male, the male will be able to produce greater amounts of strength and speed
Okay.
based on that. It's similar to why, if you look
Hmm.
an ape versus a man, pound for pound, are like insanely more strong because of their joints and their tendons and where they
Gotcha.
insert. So it's not obviously not that dramatic, but yeah, those narrower hips do help us utilize our power more efficiently.
That makes a lot of sense. I have one more for you, and then we have time for just one or more questions that are thrown in here. What gospel opportunities are here with that have arisen with this that have not with other issues? And you can answer this obviously however you want to, but one of the things that jumps out to me is like there's strange bedfellows seemingly between
Mm-hmm.
like evangelical Christians and some feminists who are like, wait a minute, is there such a thing as a woman or not? Can men invade women's spaces? Will women be safe? And I've had conversations and connections with people that normally would not want to connect with me just because of worldview differences. Is that an example of the kind of gospel issues, or answer that question as you see it as well?
Yeah, so I definitely think the strange bedfellows indeed. I've been in contact with people from the East Coast, Midwest, Canada, the UK that I would never normally get a chance to interact with. It's been really cool. A lot of them are derided by others as TERFs, so trans
Mm,
exclusionary radical feminists. Some people take it as a badge of honor, others think of it as a slur.
sure.
Um, but yeah, so this is an interesting group, and they're basically been abandoned. They really feel abandoned by the culture,
Mm,
by the academic institutions, by society at large, by the Democrat Party, by the ACLU, etc. And they're finding their backers in biblical Christians, organizations such as the Alliance Defending Freedom, who's fighting this case. Um, and yeah, we're talking objective truth, and we can unite around, yes, that there is such thing as a woman, there is such thing as a man. It's not a social construct. There's an objective reality, and so this is a population that has long rejected objective truth, and it's certainly in moral
sure.
terms for a long time. And so I don't know, maybe God's using this as a foot in the door of hearts to kind of have further conversations about other much more important objective truth aspects than this. So there's also the worldview issue about um, kind of complementarianism with this. separation of the sexes by sport. That's why we separate this the sexes. We separate because of the male advantage. Um, that separation creates equality, and so
Hmm.
you now have the chance for there to be two Olympic champions, two gold medalists, and without that separation, there really wouldn't be that opportunity, and you'd have, the top female now be in the mix. And so it really, we can point to God's beautiful design for humanity and his bimodal creation, um, and celebrate that. So I think that's a big topic that we should continually push and share the gospel when we can.
That's awesome. I appreciate you having the courage to speak into this issue. One of the things you said, we had a chance to interview you for the Think Biblically podcast, which we're going to air soon. And you made like a worldview point about how different sides of this debate have a different view of what it kind of means to be human and where truth is rooted. Can you kind of on a deeper worldview level explain some of the differences why some would look at this and say, hey, this is actually, this is fair, this is right, and the others are like, no, actually, this is not fair. What's that worldview difference beneath that difference?
Yeah, so part of it is competition versus inclusion focused. So
Okay.
one side is saying inclusion and being affirming, you affirming my reality of truth or my reality of myself is of ultimate good, and any attempts to squash that or hinder that, is one of the greatest secular sins that you can do.
Hmm.
If we just watch Disney enough, that we'll get that message. But this idea of inclusion, that and we would agree with that. We, as committed to the competition, we want everybody to be included. We want everybody to be in sports, but we just believe that we separate based on sex. And so if that individual is male, compete versus the male, and how they psychologically see themselves doesn't really matter once you get onto the track or onto the court. Now, there may be some definite issues with Christian institutions and biblically minded
Sure.
folks with that, but from a practical standpoint, um, that's the issue. The other one is, yeah, this idea of autonomy, versus ontology or givenness, at the base level, and that's
Hmm.
ultimately, I think, one of the underlying issues. But yeah, we separate the sexes, or we separate sport based on biological sex, and that's why we do it. The conversations always have to come back to that truth of why do we even have female sports, when we talk about this.
Dr. Gabe Higerd, this is great stuff. So helpful. I know this took you haven't done a dissertation in a very different area. I can only imagine how much it took to crunch a million cases and put the data together to see what it reveals. And I agree with you based on just what I've read and what you've told me. I expected the differences to be significant, but they're even more significant than I would have expected going into it. And sounds like that's the case for you. Now, people who are watching this, how can they follow you? Are you on social media, website? Have you published this yet? Tell us how they can follow you.
Yeah, so this is, I've made it open source published, my dissertation, so you can check that out. You can get a hold of me on social media, Coach Gabe Higerd, Coach Gabe Higerd. That's my Twitter, and that's Higerd. And yeah, I'd love to get in contact with you. I've kind of been, last 2 weeks, kind of been taking a fast from social media, just
Good.
personally. But after this, I'm getting back into it and re-engaging, re-engaging like I like to. But yeah, I appreciate
Good.
the chance to share and get this message out. So the more people that can realize that, hey, it's not bigotry to want to protect women. It's loving. We can love both, um, and that's really what we want to try to get out there.
At Coach Gabe Higerd. And below in the description, I have a mention of your dissertation that people could track down and find, which is great. Really appreciate keeping on. For those who are still with us, do not forget to hit subscribe. This channel is brought to you by Biola Apologetics. And we have some great behind the scenes interviews coming up with people like Wayne Grudem, Nancy Piercy, Lee Strobel coming on to talk about the books and people and experiences that shaped their life. Jack Phillips, interestingly enough, who's the one who is the baker in Colorado, who's been taken to court on multiple cases, has a book set to come out soon. He's going to come on soon and talk about his experience. It's basically about what his stance of his faith has cost him in his life. So make sure you hit subscribe and make sure you hit notifications, because we've got some great interviews coming up that you will not want to miss. Gabe, don't disappear yet. Thanks for coming on. Appreciate everybody being with us, and thanks for great questions. We'll see you all really soon. Thanks for hanging out tonight.